She stepped off the truck, and the laughter started before she said a single word. FOB Rhino, Eastern Afghanistan. Minus 14 degrees and a room full of the most dangerous men the United States military had ever produced. SEALs, Rangers, Delta operators, and every one of them was looking at her like she was a clerical error that hadn't been corrected yet. She carried a worn canvas bag. No patches on her shoulders. No unit insignia anyone could read. Sergeant Danny Kowalski pulled the mission file from her hands, held it up in front of the room, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "They sent us a tourist!" The room erupted. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just looked at him with eyes that had already seen things this room would never understand. That silence, that absolute stillness, should have been the first warning. It wasn't. If this story pulls you in, follow my channel and stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The C-130 had been a misery for 6 hours. Not the turbulence, though that had been bad enough. The aircraft bucking and shuddering through mountain thermals like something alive trying to shake loose of its own skin. Not the cold, which had crept through the fuselage and settled into bone by hour 2. What made the flight miserable was the cargo manifest. She had read it 3 times. 14 pallets of ammunition resupply. 2 crates of communications equipment tagged for 3rd Special Forces Group. 1 sealed diplomatic pouch with a routing number she wasn't cleared to look at. And 1 item listed simply as personnel, unclassified augment. That was her. Not a name, not a rank, not a unit designation or a billet code, just unclassified augment, like something the system had generated by accident and hadn't gotten around to deleting. Staff Sergeant Mara Voss sat alone in the jump seats along the port side of the aircraft, her canvas bag wedged between her boots, and watched the loadmaster move crates around in the red-lit cargo bay with the focused indifference of a man who had done this particular job too many times to find it interesting anymore. He hadn't spoken to her since Wheels Up. Nobody had. She was used to it. The bag between her feet was the same one she'd carried for 4 years. Olive drab, U.S. Army surplus. The kind of thing you could buy at any military surplus store for $12, which meant nobody could read anything into it. That was intentional. The Pelican case in the cargo hold, the one with the combination locks and the dull black exterior and the foam cutouts inside shaped precisely for components she had memorized the weight of, that told a different story. But that story wasn't for the loadmaster, or the crew, or anyone on this plane. The story in that case was for the mountain. FOB Rhino announced itself through the porthole windows as a collection of lights against total darkness. Generator-fed bulbs strung between prefab structures, watchtowers at the corners of the perimeter fence, the faint orange pulse of space heaters visible through canvas doors. The runway was gravel and compacted dirt, carved out of a plateau at roughly 7,200 feet elevation, surrounded on 3 sides by ridgelines that turned the horizon into a jagged black wall. The aircraft bumped down hard. The loadmaster dropped the ramp. Cold hit her like something physical. Not wind. There wasn't much wind at the moment, which she noted automatically, the way she noted everything automatically. Just temperature. The kind of cold that had weight to it. The kind that told you the air itself was working against you. She shouldered her bag and walked down the ramp behind a 2-man communications team who were already arguing about something involving a router configuration and a junior NCO who apparently hadn't backed up a firmware update. They peeled left toward the TOC. She stopped at the bottom of the ramp and checked her bearing. A sergeant first class in a tan fleece jacket was standing 20 meters away with a clipboard, scanning the manifest. He was built like a refrigerator, broad, solid, unhurried, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes that moved over her and then moved away, dismissing her with the efficiency of someone who had mentally filed her under "not my problem." "Kowalski," he said, not to her, to the clipboard. Then he looked up. "You the augment?" "Voss," she said. "Staff Sergeant." He looked her over once, the bag, the jacket, the absence of visible rank or unit markings, and whatever conclusion he reached, he didn't share it. He just made a mark on the clipboard. Main briefing room, 20 minutes. He turned and walked away. She followed. The main briefing room at FOB Rhino was a prefab structure with plywood floors and walls lined with maps, satellite imagery, and the kind of whiteboard notation that accumulated over weeks of continuous planning. Overlapping grids, route designations, objective names that changed every few days for OPSEC reasons, call signs and dry erase marker that someone had half erased and rewritten so many times the board had developed a ghost layer of old text underneath the current one. The room held approximately 30 people when she walked in. She clocked them without appearing to look. SEAL Team Element. She could tell by the kit configuration and the beards that had been cultivated past regulation into something that functioned more like operational camouflage than grooming preference. 2 Ranger teams, probably 75th, younger on average, tighter cut, the specific way they held themselves in a room, suggesting they were used to being the most capable unit present and were quietly calibrating whether that was still true. A Delta contingent in the back. She identified them not by any patch or marking, but by what wasn't there. No visible nervousness, no performance of readiness, just a settled quality, like men who had made peace with being in dangerous places and now simply existed in them. And then there was the rest. Staff officers, intelligence personnel, a warrant officer with a targeting cell background based on the way he'd arranged his materials on the table, an Air Force liaison. 2 people she couldn't categorize immediately, which meant they were either CIA or they were very good at not being categorized, and in this room, the distinction barely mattered. When she walked in, the conversation didn't stop. It just shifted, not obviously, not in a way anyone in the room would have admitted to, but there was a perceptible change in register. A slight drop in the ambient noise level, the way people's eyes moved and then moved away, the particular quality of attention you feel when people are looking at you while pretending not to. She had experienced this before. She had a specific name for it, privately, the recalibration. The moment when a room full of people who had built a mental model of who belonged and who didn't encountered something that didn't fit the model and had to decide what to do with the friction. Most rooms resolved the friction by dismissing the source of it. This room was going to be no different. Danny Kowalski, Sergeant First Class, she'd confirmed the rank from the cluster on his chest, was standing near the head of the room with a coffee mug and the posture of a man who owned the space. Not arrogant exactly, more like a man who had been the most capable person in every room he'd ever occupied for long enough that it had stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like a law of physics. He watched her cross the room toward the empty section of wall near the back. Then he moved. Not fast. Deliberately. The kind of movement designed to be witnessed. He crossed the floor, intercepted her path, and held out his hand. Not to shake, but palm up, waiting. She looked at the hand, then at him. "Mission file," he said. "Let me see it." She reached into her jacket and produced the folder. He took it from her fingers, held it up, and turned to face the room with the unconscious theatricality of a man who had never once questioned whether he had an audience. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough to carry, "I think someone in personnel made a mistake." He flipped the folder open, glanced at the first page, and closed it again. "They sent us a tourist." It landed. The laughter was immediate, not the polite chuckle of men who thought something was mildly amusing, but the full-chest laugh of men who had been handed permission to express something they'd already been thinking. It moved through the room in a wave. Someone in the Ranger section said something she couldn't hear that generated a second round. The Air Force liaison tried to suppress it and failed. Mara Voss stood still. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't look away. She looked at Kowalski, directly, without heat, without expression, without the flinch that would have told him he'd landed it. And she simply waited for it to run out of fuel. It was the waiting that made the laughter uncomfortable. Not anger, not confrontation, just the complete absence of reaction from the target, which had the effect of making the laughing men suddenly aware that they were the ones performing, and she was the one watching them do it. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It tapered. People found their coffee mugs and their maps. Kowalski kept his expression neutral, but something shifted in his jaw. A slight tightening, the adjustment of a man who had thrown a punch and found the target hadn't moved. He handed the folder back. She took it without a word. Lieutenant Colonel James Cross arrived 6 minutes later. He was not a large man, average height, average build, nothing about his physical presence that announced his rank before you'd read the insignia. What announced it instead was the way the room reorganized itself when he walked in. Not a snap to or a formal call to attention. This was a SOF element, not a parade ground, but an unconscious reorientation. People shifted in their seats. Conversations concluded. Eyes moved toward the front without being directed there. Cross carried his materials under his arm and set them on the table without ceremony. He scanned the room once, and his eyes landed on Mara for exactly 2 seconds, no longer, before moving on. A sergeant major materialized at his elbow and passed him a second envelope, sealed. The classification markings on the outside were visible from across the room. TS/SCI. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information. Cross broke the seal. Read the first page. His expression didn't change, but his stillness did. It became a different kind of still, the stillness of a man absorbing something unexpected. He looked at Mara again. Longer this time. Then he set the envelope on the table, face down, and began the briefing. Objective Heron, he said. Priority 1 extraction. The package is Dr. Elias Farrow, who contracted epidemiologist, lifted 3 days ago from a forward medical site in Augment province. Current location confirmed by signals intelligence. Grid reference, Foxtrot 79er. Mountain compound, fortified. 2 to 3 dozen armed personnel, mix of Haqqani-aligned and locally contracted fighters. We have a 12-hour window before the package is likely moved or... He paused, choosing the next word with the precision of a man who had learned never to use the word killed in a briefing room when lost served the same operational purpose. Unavailable. He clicked to the first slide. Overhead imagery probably taken within the last 18 hours based on the shadow angles. The compound was built into a saddle between 2 ridge lines, stone construction, at least 3 structures, a central courtyard with what looked like vehicle access through a single gate. Primary ingress, Cross continued. Alpha element, here. He touched the map. Breach and clear, building 1 and 2. Bravo element, external security, north and south approaches. The problem, he clicked to the next slide, is here. The slide showed a building on the eastern edge of the compound, set slightly apart from the main structures, with a clear sightline down the primary approach. Guard force has an elevated position. Eastern tower, 6 to 8 personnel on rotation. Any breach of the main gate is visible from that position. Primary approach becomes a kill zone inside 40 meters. We cannot execute the extraction without suppressing or neutralizing that position first. He clicked again. This slide showed terrain, the ridge line to the west of the compound, the approach routes, the elevation markers. Overwatch position, Cross said. Ridge designation. Whiskey. Elevation advantage approximately 60 meters above the compound. Distance to the eastern tower from Whiskey. He let it sit for a half second. 1,400 meters. The room absorbed that number. Master Sergeant Calvin Reed. She'd identified him during the scan, first SFODD based on his equipment configuration and the specific absence of any identifying markers, leaned back in his chair and let out a low breath through his nose. Not theatrical, just involuntary. That's not a suppression shot, said a voice from the SEAL section. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, she noted. She'd cross-referenced the face with the unit roster she'd been provided. At 1,400 in these conditions, you're not suppressing anybody. You're either making the shot or you're telling the enemy exactly where you're sitting. Correct, Cross said. Webb leaned forward. So who's taking it? The room went quiet. Not the natural quiet of a briefing, the specific, heavy quiet of a room that had just realized nobody in it wanted to answer a question. Cross didn't answer immediately. He looked at the map. He looked at Reed. And then, deliberate, unhurried, he looked at Mara. The room followed his eyes. She felt the shift before she saw it. The collective reorientation, every head in the room turning toward the back wall where she was standing. She hadn't moved since Kowalski's performance. She had her arms crossed loosely, her weight on her right foot, and she had been listening to the briefing with the focused quality of someone who was not just absorbing information, but was already running calculations on it. She unfolded her arms. I'll take it, she said. The room held for exactly 1 second. Then it came apart. The laughter this time was different from Kowalski's opener. That had been performative, social, a pack behavior. This was something raw. Webb was the first, a short, disbelieving bark. Two of the Rangers followed. Someone in the back made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cough. The noise of a man who wanted to laugh, but retained just enough professional dignity to hesitate. "You'll take it," Webb repeated, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who had found something genuinely absurd. He stood up partway, one hand on the table, like he needed the leverage. "Lady, I've been running long-range qualification for 3 years. 1,400 meters is not a distance you volunteer for. That's a number you build toward over years of work. In controlled conditions, with wind and atmospheric data, and a spotter who knows what the hell they're doing. He shook his head. That's not something someone with a canvas bag and no unit patch just offers up. Marcus, Cross's voice was flat. Not a warning exactly. More like a period at the end of Webb's sentence. Webb sat back down. But the damage was already done. Or rather, the mood was already set. Men who had been almost professional were now fully, openly skeptical. Kowalski had his arms crossed and was watching her with the expression of a man who had been right all along and was waiting for events to confirm it. Reed hadn't laughed. She'd noticed that. But he was watching her with something that wasn't doubt exactly and wasn't belief. It was the expression of a man running math he didn't yet have all the variables for. "Let me understand something," Reed said. His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who spoke rarely enough that people listened when he did. "You're looking at a 1,400-meter shot, mountain environment, which means you've got unpredictable thermals, altitude-adjusted ballistics, humidity variance. The target compound is in a saddle, which is going to create lateral wind patterns that change every couple minutes depending on ridge funneling," she said. "The saddle acts as a channel. Wind acceleration through the low point, deflection off the eastern face of the ridgeline depending on bearing. You'll get a primary vector, but there'll be a secondary rotation, probably on a 90 to 120-second cycle based on the terrain." She paused. "I'd want wind call confirmation from a spotter, but I can read the trace myself if there's no one available." Reed stopped talking. It wasn't that what she'd said was impressive, it was that it was specific, correct. Not the vocabulary of someone who had read about long-range shooting, the vocabulary of someone who had done it in conditions like these. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "What rifle?" "Whatever you have in inventory at this FOB, preferably the Macmillan TAC-50, if you have one, or the M107 as a secondary. I'll make either work." "We have the TAC-50, Reed said. To no one in particular. Then back to her. "When did you last shoot long range?" 11 days ago. "At what distance?" She looked at him. "Longer than 1,400? The room's temperature changed again. One of those small atmospheric shifts that happens when enough people in a confined space simultaneously recalibrate something. Not belief. Not yet. More like the moment when the thing you were certain was impossible starts to carry a percentage of doubt." Webb spoke again and his voice had dropped the theatrical register. "Prove it." "I intend to," she said. He spread his hands. "So prove it now. Not in the field, not on the mission. Here. Before we put this plan on the table with your name on a critical element, you prove it in front of this room." She looked at Cross. Cross looked back at her. He hadn't spoken during the exchange, hadn't intervened past the single word to Webb. He was watching the room, watching her, watching it the way a man watches a controlled experiment, not detached, but deliberate, allowing something to develop because he wanted to see what developed. "The range," she said to Cross. 1,600 hours. I'll need access to the armory to inspect available equipment before then." Cross held her gaze for another moment. "Granted," he said, simply, as if it was easy, as if he'd been waiting for exactly those words. Kowalski's jaw tightened. Webb looked like he wanted to say something else and couldn't locate the right words for it. Reed said nothing, just watched her with those flat, unreadable eyes. The eyes of a man who had spent a long time in the presence of violence and had learned to look at everything, including people, as a system of variables. The armory at FOB Rhino was 2 structures east of the briefing room, a converted storage building with a heavy padlock, and a specialist who looked about 22 years old and had the resigned expression of someone who had been told to issue equipment to a woman he didn't understand the presence of, and had decided his job description didn't require him to understand it. He handed her the Macmillan TAC 50 with the kind of care that suggested he half expected her to drop it. She didn't drop it. She rotated the rifle in her hands. Stock, barrel, the action, the scope mount. Running through a contact inspection that wasn't the cursory glance someone does for appearances, but the systematic check of someone who has learned through specific experience that the things most likely to fail are the things nobody thought to look at. She checked the scope rings for torque, found the rear left ring slightly under spec, and asked for a torque wrench. The specialist blinked at her. Torque wrench, she repeated, for the scope mount. He found one. She corrected the ring, rechecked, then pulled the bolt and inspected the chamber. There was a hairline tool mark on the breech face. Not dangerous, not even close to dangerous, but it told her something about the round she'd want to avoid seating too far forward. She filed that away. The ammunition she inspected round by round, 14 of them, holding each one at eye level and turning it slowly. 2 she set aside, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in the case neck that wouldn't matter at 400 meters and might matter at 1,400. The specialist was watching her, not with hostility anymore, with something more honest than that. "You been doing this long?" he asked. She set the 12th round aside, inspected the 13th. "Long enough." "Where were you before here?" She looked at him. He looked back, and whatever he saw in her expression made him pick up his manifest and find something on it to read. The firing range at FOB Rhino was built into the western edge of the plateau, cut into a natural depression that provided some wind shelter and clear downrange visibility to roughly 1,500 meters before the terrain rose again. Steel targets at various intervals, 300, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200, and a frame at the far end that could run paper targets for precision work. She arrived at 1550, 10 minutes early. By 1602, 47 people had found reasons to be in the general vicinity of the range. Nobody had officially announced anything. Nobody had sent a message or posted a notice. But information moves through forward operating bases the way it moves through any closed population. Efficiently, invisibly, with the specific velocity that interesting things travel. Word had gotten around that the augment was going to shoot. They stood in loose groups, not a formation, nothing organized. Operators on off-rotation, staff personnel who had come to watch, a couple of people who were probably supposed to be somewhere else and had decided this was worth the minor infraction. Kowalski was near the front, arms crossed, and there was something in his stance that suggested he'd already decided on the shape of what came next and was waiting for the picture to fill in. Webb was there. Reed was there, standing apart from the others with his arms at his sides, watching the range setup with the specific quality of attention that meant he was doing math. She set up without acknowledging the crowd. The bipod, the position, the sandbag rear support, everything placed with the unhurried precision of someone who was not performing for witnesses but had simply developed habits so ingrained that performing and not performing looked identical from the outside. She loaded, settled into position, adjusted her cheek weld until the scope picture was clear and consistent. Then she lay still for a moment, not hesitating, not preparing mentally in any theatrical sense, just letting her respiratory rate settle, letting the ground's temperature communicate itself through the mat, letting her body stop being a body in transit and start being a stable firing platform. The first target was at 800 meters. She exhaled halfway, paused at natural respiratory low, broke the trigger. The rifle fired. The steel target rang. She cycled the bolt, reloaded, and without pausing to check the spotting glass, fired again. Rang. And again. 3 shots. Same steel. She didn't move the rifle, just cycled and fired. Someone walked to the target with a spotting scope on a tripod. There was a silence while he looked through it. Then he stood up and turned around, and his face had an expression on it that didn't belong in a crowd that had come to watch failure. "Same hole," he said. "All 3. The crowd didn't erupt. It didn't do anything, which was its own kind of eruption. 47 people who had come to watch something predictable become suddenly, collectively quiet, like the sound had been edited out of a track that was supposed to have it. Kowalski's arms were still crossed, but something in the angle of his shoulders had changed. She moved to the 1,000-meter target, shot the same sequence, 3 rounds. The man with the spotting scope walked and looked and came back and didn't need to say anything because the look on his face said it. She went to 1,200. By the time she fired the first round at 1,200 meters, the crowd had reorganized itself. The loose social groups had dissolved. People were standing individually or in pairs, and the conversations that had been happening in the background, since the low murmurs, the comments, the predictions, had stopped. What replaced them was a different kind of attention, the kind that doesn't have a social component, the kind that happens when a person's brain is trying to process something it didn't have a category for. Reed hadn't moved from his position. He was watching through his own optic, a compact spotting scope he'd produced from somewhere, and he was tracking every shot. She could tell because she could see him tracking, not skeptically anymore. Professionally, she adjusted for the wind, not based on a wind meter. She hadn't asked for one, and there wasn't one in her position. She read the mirage through the scope, a shimmering distortion in the air at mid-range that told her the thermal gradient and direction, and she made the adjustment on the elevation and windage turrets with 2 precise clicks. Then she fired. Hit. Reed lowered the spotting scope very slightly, just a few degrees. The gesture of a man reconfiguring. She fired twice more at 1,200, both hit. She packed up the position, moved, rebuilt it downrange to a pre-scouted location that added roughly another 100 meters of effective distance, and made the adjustments to her data book with a pen while the crowd waited in silence. This was the last shot she called publicly. She'd told the armory specialist 1,400 meters, but she'd set the position at 1,340, close enough to establish the point, conservative enough that the conditions wouldn't introduce variables she couldn't control in a demonstration setting. She fired once. Hit. She held her position for 3 seconds, which is a habit rather than a choice. You stay down after the shot until you verified the impact and confirmed no counterfire. And then she rose, cleared the weapon, and stood up. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. The energy in the crowd wasn't celebratory. It was something stranger than that, more disoriented. The feeling of people who had arrived at a place having expected something specific and found something else and hadn't yet processed the gap. Webb was standing with his hands in his pockets. He was staring at the range, not at her. At the range, as if the ground itself might explain something. Kowalski hadn't moved. His arms were still folded. His expression was neutral in the specific way that takes effort. The neutrality of a man who is working hard to show nothing because what he would naturally show is not something he wants seen. Reed walked over to her. He stopped close enough that the conversation was private, but not so close it was theatrical. He looked at her for a long moment with those evaluating eyes. "Where'd you train?" he said. It was a test, a different kind than the range, quieter, more dangerous. "Where'd you train?" was a question with follow-up questions behind it. A hand extended to see if she'd take it and where it would lead. She met his eyes. "That's in the file." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who knew exactly what "that's in the file" meant, because in this world, "that's in the file" and "that's classified" were often the same sentence. "The shot you didn't take," he said. "The one past 1,400. She looked at him. "You stopped at 1,340, he said. Not accusing, not even a question, just a man reading the math correctly. "Why?" She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said quietly, "Because I want some distance left over for the one that matters." Reed looked at her for a long time. Then he walked away without saying anything else. Well, the briefing reconvened at 1900 hours. The plan was laid out in full. Route for Alpha and Bravo elements, communications protocols, extraction timeline, contingencies for compromise and for package condition. She was assigned Whiskey Ridge. She'd have a spotter if Reed could free one from Bravo element. If not, she'd run it solo. Cross went through the plan with the clipped, precise efficiency of a man who had done this enough times that the briefing had become ritual, necessary, specific, but stripped of everything that wasn't operational information. He didn't ask for questions. He asked for concerns. Nobody voiced one. Not about the plan. Not about the route. Not about the contingencies. And not about her. She noted that, filed it alongside everything else. After the room cleared, Kowalski passed her near the door. He didn't stop, but he slowed, just slightly, just enough. And he looked at her sideways, and there was something in that look that wasn't an apology, and wasn't acknowledgement, but was something that sat between them like a thing he hadn't decided what to do with yet. She kept walking. In the equipment room alone, she ran a final function check on the TAC 50 in the low light. Everything correct. Everything seated. The 2 rounds she'd pulled from the ammunition supply were on the table beside her. She left them there. She had 12 rounds. She planned to use considerably fewer. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees. The ridgeline to the west was invisible in the darkness, just a place where stars stopped. Somewhere out there, at a distance she had already calculated, in a compound she had already memorized, a man who didn't know any of this was happening was still alive. She intended to keep him that way. That was the job. That was always the job. And somewhere behind her, in a room full of men who had spent the last 4 hours being forced to reorganize their understanding of what possible looked like, Lieutenant Colonel Cross opened the TS/SCI envelope again. Read the second page, the one he hadn't read in the briefing, the page with her actual record on it. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he set it down, face up this time, and looked at the ceiling. "Hell," he said quietly, to the empty room. He read it again. Then he reached for his radio and called the mission clock. They had 9 hours. Cross set the envelope down at 2003 hours, and for approximately 90 seconds, he sat in an empty room with a document that changed the operational calculus of everything he'd just planned. Then he picked up his radio. "Sergeant Major." A pause, static, then, "Sir." "Find Reed, my office, 10 minutes. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The sergeant major had been in the Army long enough to know that when a lieutenant colonel called at 2003 hours with a 10-minute window, the explanation was in the tone, not the words. Cross folded the document back into the envelope, face down this time, and went to make coffee he wouldn't drink. Reed arrived in 9 minutes, which was the kind of precision that didn't come from rushing, but from already being awake and already moving. He came through the door without knocking. The protocol at this hour in a space like this was knock and enter simultaneously, which was functionally the same as not knocking. And he stopped when he saw Cross's face. Not the envelope, the face. Reed had been reading people in high-pressure environments for 15 years. He'd learned early that what a man's face does in the first 3 seconds after you enter a room tells you more than anything he's likely to say in the next 10 minutes. Cross's face right now was doing the specific thing that faces did when someone had been handed information they didn't know what to do with. "Close the door," Cross said. Reed closed it. Cross didn't reach for the envelope immediately. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, set it back down. "How'd she look to you?" he said. "At the range." Reed pulled a chair back from the table and sat in it, not across from Cross, but at an angle, the position of a man settling in for a real conversation rather than a briefing. "You already know how she looked," he said. "You were there. I know what I saw. I'm asking what you saw." Reed considered that for a moment. Outside, a generator cycled through a load change and the lights in the room dimmed briefly and came back. 3-shot groups at 800 and 1,000 that would embarrass most people on a controlled range with ideal conditions, he said. 1,200 in a wind that was switching directions every 90 seconds, which means she wasn't just shooting, she was reading the air pattern and timing the shot inside the cycle. And she stopped at 1,340 and called it 1,400. He looked at Cross. She stopped short on purpose. Why would she do that? 2 reasons. 1, she didn't want to show the room her full capability. 2, he paused. She's holding range in reserve. For the mission. Cross nodded slowly. He reached for the envelope, slid it across the table. Reed looked at it without touching it. Then he picked it up and opened it. He read slowly. He was not a man who skimmed. Cross watched him read and watched the small things that happened in his face. Not dramatic reactions, just the minor recalibrations of a man who was updating a model with new variables. When he finished, he set the document on the table. "How classified is this?" he said. "The page you just read doesn't exist," Cross said. "The program it references doesn't exist. The unit designation in the 3rd paragraph hasn't existed officially for 4 years. But she exists." "Evidently." Reed looked at the document for another moment. Then he looked at Cross. She's done this before. Apparently more times than the record I was given initially suggested, Cross said. The document you're holding fills in some gaps, not all of them. How many gaps are left? Cross looked at the ceiling. Enough that I'm not sure what I'm working with. Reed was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence of thought, but concentration of it. Does she know you have this? I don't know what she knows, Cross said, and that's the part that's keeping me awake at 2,000 hours. Reed pushed the document back across the table. You're not asking me whether she can take the shot. No. You're asking whether you can trust her on the ridge alone with no overwatch, no backup element, and 9 hours until infill. Yes. Reed stood up. He walked to the window. There wasn't much to see through it, just the dark perimeter and the watchtower light on its slow rotation, and he stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Yeah, he said finally, you can trust her. Based on what? Based on the fact that she stopped short on the range. He turned around. Someone who is trying to impress a room hits the full distance, makes the biggest number she can make. That's what people do when they're performing. He shook his head. She wasn't performing. She was qualifying. There's a difference, and you can't fake it. Cross held his gaze for a long moment. Get some sleep, he said. We're wheels up at 02:30. She didn't sleep. This wasn't anxiety. She'd learned the difference years ago between the sleeplessness that came from a mind running hot with fear and the sleeplessness that came from a mind running hot with preparation. Fear made you restless. Preparation made you focused. Both kept you awake, but only one of them was useful. She sat on her cot in the transient quarters, with her data book open across her knees, and worked through the firing solution in segments. The range from Whiskey to the Eastern Tower, adjusted for the elevation differential. Atmospheric density at altitude, lower than sea level, which meant the projectile's flight path would be flatter, but the wind correction would be more sensitive because there was less air resistance acting as a stabilizing medium. Temperature at the estimated time of the shot. She'd been given the meteorological forecast for the area and had cross-referenced it against the elevation and the specific orientation of the saddle, working out where the cold air pooling from the ridgelines would interact with whatever thermal gradient the compound structures were generating by the time she was in position. It was not a clean calculation. It never was. That was the part people who hadn't done this work didn't understand. They imagined precision shooting as a mathematical exercise, a formula you applied, and a result you received. And mathematics was part of it, a necessary part, but the math was a foundation, not a ceiling. Above the math was the part that couldn't be reduced to calculation, the real-time reading of conditions that changed between the moment you set your elevation and the moment the round reached the target, the physical feedback of the rifle, the relationship between your body's stillness and the shot's outcome. The 10,000 small decisions that happen in the space between exhale and trigger break that no formula could fully account for. She'd been doing this for 8 years. She'd learned the math in the first 2. Everything since had been learning the part above it. She was working through her wind call methodology for the saddle terrain when the door opened. She didn't look up from the data book. She heard 2 sets of boots, one heavier, the gait she'd cataloged as Kowalski's from multiple observations since arrival, and one she didn't immediately place. Voss, Kowalski said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with a mug in each hand. Behind him was Specialist Torres from the armory. She recognized him from the torque wrench request. Looking like a man who had been conscripted into a social situation he didn't fully understand and was managing it by being very still. Kowalski held out one of the mugs. She looked at it, then at him. It's coffee, he said. Not a peace offering, just coffee. She took it. The mug was hot, and the coffee smelled like it had been sitting in the pot for about 2 hours, which was standard for this hour at this kind of installation. She wrapped both hands around it and waited. Kowalski didn't come in. He stayed in the doorway, which she read correctly as a man who was making an approach and hadn't decided yet whether he was committing to it. The 1,200-meter groups, he said. Those were real. They were. Webb thinks you got lucky with the wind. Webb can think what he wants. Kowalski looked at the floor, then back at her. I've been at this FOB for 8 months, he said. Best long-range shooter we had on site was Reed's guy, Paulson. Paulson's best confirmed engagement was 1,050. And he trained for 2 years under a SOCOM marksmanship instructor to get there. He paused. So you understand why? I understand why, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She let it be quiet. Where'd you come from? He said finally. Not challenging, genuinely asking, which was different. Personnel augment pool, she said. He knew that wasn't an answer. He also knew that she knew he knew that. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face settled, like a man who had asked a question and received exactly the answer that confirmed his suspicion without giving him anything new to work with. Don't get killed up there, he said. He left. Torres followed him, the door swinging shut behind both of them. She looked at the coffee, drank some. It was bad. She went back to the data book. Myet. At 0140 hours, she was in the equipment bay running a final kit check when Webb came in. He didn't have a mug. He didn't have any particular pretext. He just came in and stood near the weapons rack and watched her move through the check with his arms folded and his mouth in a flat line. And for a while, neither of them said anything. She was pulling on the cold weather layer when he spoke. I've been trying to figure you out, he said. Good luck with that. I'm serious. He shifted his weight. I've been on 3 different teams in the last 6 years. I've worked with the best shooters in the inventory. SEAL snipers, Marine Scout, Army Special Forces guys with more confirmed kills than most people have total deployments. I know what good looks like. He paused. What you did on the range today doesn't fit any of those categories. She pulled the fleece layer down and started on the outer shell. Maybe your categories are the problem. Maybe. He unfolded his arms, put his hands in his pockets instead, which she read as a man physically demonstrating that he was lowering a defensive posture. I also know what luck looks like. And it doesn't look like that. She stopped what she was doing, turned to face him fully. He looked back. His face was doing something she recognized. The expression of a person who has been wrong about something significant and is in the process of adjusting, which is different from admitting it. Admitting it was what came later, or didn't come at all. The adjustment happened first in private with this particular expression. You coming to me with something? She said. Or just processing out loud? He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Both, maybe. He looked at the equipment on the table. You're running the TAC-50 solo, no spotter. Reed needs his people on the ground element. I know, I'm saying... He stopped, recalibrated. I'm saying I can cover whiskey, as your spotter. The room was quiet for a moment. You're assigned to Alpha Element Breach, she said. Garrett can run the breach. He's done it 5 times. I'm the redundant shooter in that configuration anyway. He met her eyes. Up on that ridge, you're calling your own wind, your own corrections, tracking multiple potential targets across a fortified compound in the dark. That's a 2-person job. She studied him. Not his face, she was reading the whole of him. The posture, the specific quality of the offer, the things underneath the words that told you whether a person was being straight with you or whether they had an angle. He was being straight. Cross needs to approve the team change, she said. I already talked to Cross. She looked at him. When? About an hour ago. She processed that. An hour ago, Webb had gone to Cross and proposed a configuration change to put himself on whiskey with her, which meant he'd made the decision before he came in here, which meant this wasn't an offer, it was a notification. He was telling her what had already been agreed. You could have just told me that at the start, she said. I wanted to see how you'd receive it. And? He looked at the equipment on the table again. You didn't tell me to go to hell, he said. So, that's something. She turned back to the kit and started working through the final checks on the scope again. Caps, turret settings, reticle clarity in the low light. Behind her, she heard Webb start pulling his own gear off the rack. They worked in silence for a while. It was a different silence than the one in the briefing room. That one had been charged with the electricity of a room organizing itself against her. This one was the silence of 2 people doing work that needed doing. Webb, she said, without turning around. Yeah. The wind call on the ridge. I'll run primary. I figured. You call secondaries and I'll tell you when I want to check. Copy. She pulled the last piece of kit into place and picked up the TAC-50. And don't do that thing where spotters try to anticipate the shot. A pause. What thing? You know what thing. where you see the trigger start to move and you call the wind adjustment a half second too early because you think you're helping. She looked at him over her shoulder. You're not helping. You're pushing the shot. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay. Okay. They lifted their gear and walked out into the cold. The infill route from the FOB to Whiskey took 3 hours and 40 minutes on foot. There were vehicle options, a MRA. P could have covered 2/3 of the distance in under 20 minutes along the single serviceable track, but vehicles meant noise and noise meant compromise, and compromise at this stage of the mission meant everything downstream fell apart. So they walked, 4 kilometers of managed trail, then 2 kilometers of cross-country movement across a terrain that was stones and frozen ground and occasional ice sheeting over rock faces. Elevation gain of approximately 340 meters, with gear that averaged between 60 and 70 pounds per person. Mara carried the TAC 50 in the Pelican case on a modified pack frame, which added 22 pounds to her base load and changed her center of gravity in ways she'd spent 3 days before deployment learning to compensate for. In practice, that meant a slightly wider stance on uncertain footing and a specific attention to left side hip placement on uphill traverses that she did automatically now, without thinking, the way you stop thinking about breathing once you've learned to control it. Webb moved well, better than she'd expected. Not that she'd expected him to move badly, but there was a specific quality of movement in mountain terrain that you either developed or you didn't. And a lot of operators who were excellent in other environments simply hadn't logged enough high-altitude hours to develop the economy of motion that mountain terrain demanded. Webb had it. He adjusted his pace on the steep sections, found the same natural footholds she was finding, and never once lost ground on her despite the weight differential in his favor. They didn't talk on the approach. There was nothing to say that wasn't already said, and in this terrain, conversation was a liability. It cost breath, disrupted rhythm, and created noise. At the 2-hour mark, they crossed a ridgeline, and she got her first direct view of the compound. She stopped. So did Webb, coming up beside her. The compound was visible as a gray mass against the darker gray of the mountain saddle, approximately 1,100 meters distant at their current position. They still had distance to cover to reach Whiskey, and even at this range, in starlight augmented by the passive night observation device she wore, she could see the layout matching the satellite imagery she'd memorized. 3 main structures. Central courtyard, the eastern tower rising above the compound's eastern wall, a blocky shape against the ridgeline behind it, with what she estimated as 2 figures visible on the platform. She watched for 45 seconds, long enough to confirm guard rotation timing, which she'd been given as 12 to 15 minutes in the intelligence brief, but needed to verify independently because intelligence briefs were written by people who weren't standing on the ridgeline looking at the thing. The figures on the tower exchanged positions at 43 seconds into her observation. That was a rotation, not a shift. 2 guards sharing one position, probably for warmth, swapping the active observation role on a sub-minute cycle. She noted it, filed it, moved. Whiskey was a natural firing position carved by geology rather than design, a shelf of rock protruding from the ridgeline at an angle that gave a clear sight line to the compound's eastern face while providing lateral cover from the flanks. Someone, probably in a previous operation that had used this terrain, had left behind the remnants of a position, a slight indentation in the rock shelf where a bipod would seat naturally, a small depression that functioned as a natural shooting mat, and a pile of stones arranged at the left edge that could have been accidental or could have been deliberate cover for a spotter position. She chose to believe it was deliberate. Webb took the spotter position without being directed to it. She set up the rifle. The altitude at Whiskey was approximately 7,560 feet. She'd confirmed it against the GPS, which meant her ballistic data needed a density-altitude adjustment. She'd already worked the numbers. She dialed the corrections into the turrets and then held them, running the math one more time in her head to make sure. The eastern tower was 1,387 meters from her current position. Not 1,400, 1,387. She noted the difference, made the additional correction, and held. Webb had his spotting scope up and was running his own orientation, landmark identification, range confirmation, wind reading at various distances. She could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, and she noted that he was doing the thing she'd asked him not to do, which was going quiet when she started to settle into position, as if her settling was a signal he needed to respond to. "You're holding your breath," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped. "Let a breath out." "Okay. Slightly. Natural rate. We've got time." "Right." A pause. Wind moved across the shelf. She felt it before she heard it, a pressure change on the left side of her face that told her the direction, and she reached up and wet her finger and held it out, tracking the vector. "Wind's coming off the eastern face," Webb said. "About 6 to 8 knots. Variable." 7, she said. "And it's cycling. Give me a count when it drops." He watched. 30 seconds passed. It dropped. She checked her watch, noted the time, waited. Another 48 seconds. Dropped again. 48-second cycle at the current thermal conditions. She filed it. In another 2 hours, when the temperature dropped further before dawn, the cycle would change. Thermals would weaken. Wind would become more consistent, but slower. She'd need to recalculate at that point, which was fine. She had the time. Somewhere below them, in a compound she could see through her scope as a collection of structures and heat signatures and moving guards. Dr. Elias Farrow was either sleeping or wasn't sleeping, and didn't know that 2 people on a frozen rock shelf above him were spending their night doing arithmetic on his behalf. She'd never met the man. Didn't know what he looked like beyond the photograph in the mission brief. Mid-50s, bearded since his capture, based on the timeline, probably thinner. Didn't know much about him beyond the operational fact of his existence and the organizational fact of his importance. It didn't matter. The mission wasn't personal. It never was. That was another thing people got wrong about this work. They imagined it required either hatred of the target or devotion to the protected. Strong feeling in one direction or another. In her experience, strong feeling was a liability. What the work required was clarity. The clearer you were, the better you saw. The better you saw, the better you shot. She settled in and watched the tower. It. At 0412, Webb's radio clicked twice. Alpha element, reporting position. She keyed her own radio twice in response. Whiskey, set. The acknowledgement came back as 1 click. Cross, monitoring from the command element, holding position 800 meters south. They were synchronized now. 13 people moving in darkness toward a compound with 30-plus armed defenders, dependent on 2 people on a rock shelf above the eastern wall to clear the problem that couldn't be cleared any other way. She breathed. The tower guards had settled into their pattern. She'd been watching for 90 minutes now and had confirmed a rotation every 8 to 9 minutes, with a 12-minute interval on the 3rd cycle, probably coinciding with a checkpoint call on their radio. During the long interval, both figures tended to face inward toward the compound rather than outward toward the approach routes. That was the window. "Alpha's moving," Webb said quietly. He was reading the radio traffic on his earpiece, translating the click code into plain language for her because her attention needed to stay on the scope. "Copy," she said. 2 minutes to the outer wall. She tracked the tower. The guards had rotated 40 seconds ago. She was 7 minutes into the standard cycle, which meant in approximately 90 seconds they would swap again and the inward-facing window would open. 1 minute, Webb said. She found the lead guard's torso in the scope. He was wearing a heavy coat, facing west. She could see the outline of the weapon across his body. Slung, not held, which meant he wasn't in an alert posture. That was useful. That was also temporary. 30 seconds. She dialed the elevation 1 click for the final confirmation of 0. The wind was at 6 knots, stable for the last 40 seconds of the cycle. She was inside the window. "Alpha at the wall," Webb said. "Breach in." The eastern tower guard turned. Not the rotation, the wrong guard, the wrong direction, and the wrong time. He'd turned outward, away from the compound, and he was raising something. Binoculars, she registered. He was raising binoculars and scanning the southern approach, which was where Alpha element was currently pressing against the wall, and if he swept left, he would cover that exact position in approximately— "He's scanning," she said. Level voice. Not loud. "I see it," Webb said. No panic in his voice either. This was the thing about working with someone who'd been in the field long enough. The crises that made inexperienced people loud made experienced people quiet. Alpha's at the wall. They're static. He was giving her the information, not telling her what to do with it. Good. She had two choices. She could wait. Alpha was pressed against the wall. A static target in darkness was hard to identify at this distance. The guard might sweep and find nothing. Or she could take the shot early before the mission clock started, which would compress the extraction timeline and remove the overwatch capability if a follow-up shot was needed. She was thinking through it when the guard stopped sweeping. He'd found something. She saw it in the posture change, the binoculars coming up slightly, the body stilling, the particular quality of arrested motion that meant attention rather than scanning. He'd found them. She exhaled halfway, paused at the bottom, broke the trigger. The rifle fired and the guard dropped, and the sound of the shot rolled out across the mountain saddle like a stone thrown into still water. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the compound erupted. The sound of the shot hadn't finished rolling across the saddle before she was cycling the bolt. Brass ejected. New round seated. She was already moving the reticle. The compound below went from sleeping to awake in the span of 4 seconds. She watched it happen through the scope. The way you watch water reaching a boil, the moment where stillness becomes motion all at once. Lights came on in the main structure, not electric, flame-based, which told her the compound's generator wasn't running at night. Figures emerged from doorways. Someone was shouting, the sound carrying up the ridgeline as a distorted fragment of urgency without intelligible words. And then there were more shouts. And the courtyard that had been empty was suddenly not empty. Her radio clicked 3 times fast. Alpha element. They'd heard the shot and were reading the compound's response and wanted to know if the breach was still viable. She keyed twice. Go. Webb was already talking, low and quick, reading what was in front of them. 2 armed south courtyard moving toward the gate. Rooftop, building 2. 1 figure, I can't tell if he's got optics. A pause. The tower's clear. Your shot dropped clean. I know, she said. She'd confirmed the impact herself in the fraction of a second between trigger break and bolt cycle. Give me the rooftop figure. Building 2, rooftop, northeast corner. Call it 1310 from your position. She found him. A man in a dark coat pressed against the parapet of the second building's roof, holding something at chest height. She couldn't resolve the object clearly at this magnification in this light, but the way he was holding it was not the way you held a radio and not the way you held binoculars. The angle of his elbows, the width of his grip. Long gun. She moved the reticle. Wind was still at 6 knots, stable. The thermal cycle hadn't shifted in the last 3 minutes, which meant she was inside the consistent window she'd been waiting for all night and didn't know how much longer it would hold. Below, Alpha element was breaching the gate. She heard it, the steel crack of the breaching charge, small, surgical, designed to open without announcing itself to the entire mountain range, which it mostly succeeded at. And then the radio clicked 5 times in rapid sequence, which was Alpha element's signal for breach successful, internal. The rooftop figure heard it too. She watched him turn, a smooth rotation toward the sound of the breach, and the object at his chest came up, and it was absolutely a weapon. She could see the barrel line now against the lighter gray of the sky behind him. She broke the trigger. He dropped. Webb was already moving to the next problem. South courtyard, 2 armed, they've stopped moving. They heard the second shot, and they've stopped. Stopped was dangerous. Moving targets were predictable. Stopped targets were thinking, and thinking targets were looking for the source. And if they found the source, give me the leftmost one, she said. Left target, call it 1,290, slight depression from your elevation. He's lower than the rooftop position, soft ground absorption. You'll want a hair more. I have it, she fired. The left figure went down. The right one broke immediately, not toward cover, but back toward the main structure, a panicked retreat rather than a tactical withdrawal, and she let him go. He was no longer in a position to engage Alpha, and he was heading away from the package's probable location, and a moving target in retreat used ammunition she might need for something that wasn't retreating. He's running, Webb said. I see him. Let him go. A half-second of silence, then, copy. Below, she could hear the firefight starting inside the compound. Not through the scope, through the air, the distinct rhythm of close-quarters contact, short controlled bursts punctuated by the crack of individual shots. Alpha was working the first building. She tracked the courtyard and the perimeter for anyone trying to flank or break out, and found the courtyard mostly clear now. The figures who'd emerged in the first seconds of the alert having either gone to ground inside the structures or retreated. Then the north perimeter. A figure came over the wall. Not through the gate, over the wall itself, which meant either someone very motivated or someone very scared, and the way this figure was moving, low, fast, not returning fire, not looking back, suggested scared. But scared people with weapons were not automatically non-combatants, and this figure had a weapon. She could see the outline clearly, and he was heading in a direction that would put him on the southern approach in approximately 40 seconds, which was where Cross's command element was holding. North wall, she said. Single figure, X-filing, bearing 240. He's heading toward command. I see him. Webb's voice was tight. He's moving fast. Is Cross aware? Webb keyed his radio, spoke the grid, got a response she couldn't hear. Command sees him. They're moving. They won't have the angle. He'll be behind the rock feature before they can... I know. She found the figure in the scope. He was fast, faster than she'd expected, covering ground at a sprint despite the terrain, the weapon banging against his back on a sling. Distance was approximately 1,190 meters, and closing as he ran perpendicular to her position. A moving target at that range was a different calculation entirely. She'd need to lead him, account for the lateral movement, and the ground he was running across was uneven, which meant his head height was oscillating. She tracked him. Matched his speed with the reticle. Let the rhythm develop, the way you let a song develop before you find the beat. And when she had the pattern, she moved the lead point 2 meters ahead of his center mass and held there while he ran into the space she was already pointing at. She fired. He went down at 1,170 meters, mid-stride, rolling once on the frozen ground and then stopping. She cycled the bolt and moved back to the compound perimeter. He's down, Webb said, flat, factual. The voice of a man who was processing what he'd just watched and had decided that processing was something he'd do later. Command acknowledges. Her radio clicked twice. Cross. She clicked once. Acknowledged. Inside the compound, the firing tempo had changed. She could hear it shift from the sustained rhythm of a room-clearing sequence to the shorter, more sporadic sound of consolidation, which usually meant Alpha had control of one or more structures and was holding while they moved to the next. It didn't mean the problem was solved. It meant one piece of the problem was solved. How many buildings has Alpha cleared? She asked. Webb listened to his earpiece. Building 1 confirmed. 2 personnel detained. They're moving to Building 2 now. He paused. Building 3 is dark. No movement confirmed. Building 3 was where the intelligence assessment had placed the package. Dark and still didn't mean empty. It could mean the remaining defenders had consolidated there, which would mean Alpha was walking into a prepared position. She swept her scope to Building 3. Stone construction, 2 windows visible from her angle, both dark. The roof was flat, no elevated coverage. A narrow passage between Building 3 and the perimeter wall, maybe 2 meters wide, that created a natural funnel if anyone tried to approach from the east. A shape moved in the passage, low, pressed against the wall. Moving slowly, not the movement of someone fleeing or attacking, but the movement of someone staying in shadow deliberately. She tracked it. Webb, passage east of Building 3. He found it. A pause while he resolved the shape through the spotting scope. One figure, moving south. I can't... Another pause. He's not carrying a weapon. I don't see a weapon. She looked harder. The figure was moving with the specific, careful quality of someone trying not to make sound. Not the tactical movement of a trained fighter, but the instinctive stealth of a person who was afraid and was trying to exist in the space between being seen and not being seen. That might be our package, she said. Intel had him in Building 3. Intel had him in Building 3 when they ran the last signals pass at 1800 yesterday. That was 11 hours ago. She tracked the figure. He's mobile, and he's heading for the east wall, which was directly in her sight line, and directly toward the open ground below the eastern tower, which was now unoccupied, which meant if Pharaoh reached the wall and climbed it, he would be standing in open ground with no cover and no support for approximately 60 meters until he hit the first natural rock feature. Alpha needs to know, Webb said. Alpha is in a building, she said. If I put this on the radio right now, I'm interrupting a room clear. So we hold. We hold. She kept her reticle on the passage, on the moving shape. and we make sure nothing engages him from the courtyard before he reaches the wall. Webb swiveled the spotting scope back to the courtyard. Courtyard's clear right now. 2 bodies from your earlier shots. No new movement. A beat. South door of Building 2 just opened. Her scope moved. A figure in the south doorway of Building 2, not X-filing, holding the door frame, scanning the courtyard. Weapon up. This was a defender who had survived the initial contact and was now looking for targets, and the passage where Pharaoh was moving was within his sight line if he turned 20 degrees left. Building 2, south door, she said. He's going to see the passage. Range? 1,295. Wind shifted, picking up from the north, maybe 8 knots. She adjusted 2 clicks right. The figure in the doorway was still scanning east. He hadn't turned yet, but he was going to. The passage was the natural next place to look. It was where movement would go if you were defending the eastern approach, and this figure was methodical. She could see it in the way he was moving his scan. He turned left. She fired. The doorway was empty. She cycled the bolt, checked the passage. Pharaoh, if it was Pharaoh, had stopped moving. He'd heard the shot and had pressed himself flat against the wall. She could see the shape of him, motionless, probably trying to understand what had just happened. He stopped, Webb said. I see it. If he stays there, he won't. She watched. Give him 10 seconds. 8 seconds. The shape peeled off the wall and started moving again, faster now, toward the east wall. He'd decided that whatever had fired the shot was either protecting him or wasn't targeting him, and staying still was more dangerous than moving. Smart man. He reached the wall. She watched him struggle with it. Not a trained climb, the effortful scrabble of someone who hadn't done this before, fingers finding gaps in the stone, boots scraping. And part of her wanted to radio Alpha, and part of her knew that the radio was still a risk, that Alpha was still in a building that hadn't been called clear. Then Alpha called it. 5 clicks. Building 2, clear. 3 clicks after that. Moving to Building 3. She keyed her radio. Whiskey. Package may be externally mobile. East wall. A pause. Cross's voice came on, level and clipped. Say again, Whiskey. Single figure, east wall, no weapon visible, consistent with package description. He's attempting to exfil independently. Another pause, shorter. Copy Whiskey. Alpha redirect, east wall, external. And then to her, cover him. Already doing it, she said. Pharaoh, she was committing to the identification now. The probability was high enough, had made it to the top of the wall. She watched him pause there, crouched on top of the stone, and she could see even at this distance that he was breathing hard, his shoulders moving with it, looking out at the open ground below him with the expression she couldn't see but could read from the hesitation in his body. The ground looked very open and very empty, and he didn't know what was out there. She couldn't tell him. He dropped off the wall. He landed badly. Not a controlled drop, a fall. His footing wrong on the rocky ground below. And he went to one knee and stayed there for a moment. She kept the scope on the wall above him, on the courtyard behind the wall, on the Building 2 roof line, on every surface that could produce a threat in the next 30 seconds. Nothing moved. Pharaoh got up, started moving east, away from the compound, into the open ground, toward Whiskey. Not directly. He didn't know where Whiskey was, didn't know he was moving toward a position, but the natural route away from the compound wall in this terrain was the depression between 2 rock features that led to the base of the ridgeline, and the base of the ridgeline was the most logical exfil route, and also happened to be the ground beneath her position. He's moving this direction, Webb said. The surprise in his voice was not quite suppressed. I know. That's going to complicate. I know. She tracked the compound. 3 figures emerging from Building 3's east-facing door, defenders, weapons visible, scanning the exterior. They'd found the empty room. They knew the package was out. 3 targets, Building 3 east door, she said. They're going to see him in about 20 seconds. Webb found them in the spotting scope. Range 1,310. Wind, same as last adjustment. Give me target priority. Leftmost first, he's got the angle on Pharaoh's route. Middle second. Right one is behind the doorframe, partial cover. She had the leftmost in the reticle. Fired. Cycled. Found the middle. Fired. The rightmost one pulled back into the doorway. She couldn't take the shot without a clean exposure. And partial cover shots at this distance and in these conditions had a probability distribution she wasn't willing to bet a man's life on. "He's back inside," Webb said. "I know. He'll come out a different door." "I know." She swept the building. The compound had gone relatively quiet. The firefight inside had stopped, which either meant Alpha had control or something had gone wrong, and she didn't have a radio call to clarify yet. "Where's Pharaoh?" "Still moving. He's in the depression." A pause. "He's limping, from the drop off the wall, I think." She pictured it. A man in his mid-50s, however many days of captivity in him, climbing a wall in the dark and dropping wrong on frozen rocky ground, now limping away from a compound that was actively searching for him while an extraction team worked through the last building. "Can he make it to the Ridgeline base on his own?" she asked. "At that pace, maybe 10, 12 minutes? Webb checked something. "Alpha's going to clear Building 3 and, I don't know, they haven't called it yet. Then we cover him until they do." She kept her scope on the compound. The right side defender came out of a different door. Webb had called it right. Emerging from Building 3's north face and scanning east. He had a rifle, and he was moving along the perimeter wall in a pattern that would bring him to the east wall in approximately 45 seconds. And from the top of the east wall, he would have direct sightline on Pharaoh's position in the depression. She engaged him at 1,340 meters, a slightly longer shot than the previous sequence, with the wind still holding from the north at 8 knots. The correction she'd already dialed held. He went down. Webb made a sound. Not a word, just an exhale, the involuntary release of a man who had been holding himself very still. "How many is that?" he said. She didn't answer because the number wasn't the relevant variable right now, but she noted it internally. 7 engagements since the mission clock started, all confirmed, 0 missed. She also noted that she had 5 rounds remaining and the mission was not resolved. 5 rounds. She'd planned for 12. She'd budgeted conservatively because conservative budgeting was how you didn't run empty at the worst possible moment. But the compound had produced more threats than the intelligence assessment had anticipated, and she'd used 2 rounds more than her optimal burn rate. She didn't say this to Webb. He had enough to track. "Alpha's calling," Webb said. "Building 3. A pause. "Building 3 is clear. Package not found." She clicked her radio. "Whiskey. Package is external. East in the depression, approximately 200 meters from the wall. He's mobile but compromised. Bearing 090 from the east gate." Cross's voice. "Copy. Alpha, redirect external. Whiskey, maintain overwatch." She maintained overwatch. The compound had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of control. It was the quiet of reduced personnel, which was not the same thing. She'd accounted for 7. The original intelligence estimate was 2 to 3 dozen. The math suggested there were still people in that compound she hadn't seen yet, and people she hadn't seen yet were the ones she needed to worry about. She swept systematically. Building 1, Alpha had it, clear. Building 2. She could see 2 of Alpha's operators through the open south door, moving efficiently, the specific economy of a trained element that had finished its task and was transitioning. Building 3, clear. The courtyard. Movement. Northwest corner of the courtyard, near what appeared to be a storage structure that hadn't been identified in the target briefing. A low door, partially open. She'd looked at that corner 4 times in the last hour, and the door had been closed each time. It was open now. She held her reticle on the door and waited. A figure emerged low, not through the door, but from under what she now saw was a canvas tarp, stretched between the storage structure and the perimeter wall. A concealed position she and Webb and the entire intelligence team had looked at from every available angle and hadn't identified as a position. The figure was wearing something bulky on his right shoulder. Irregular shape, cylindrical, with a back-end assembly she recognized in the fraction of a second before the identification was complete. RPG. Rocket-propelled grenade launcher, shoulder-fired. Range approximately 200 meters effective, capable of significant personnel and material damage, and the operator was orienting toward the east wall, toward the open ground where Pharaoh was. No, not Pharaoh. She was wrong about the bearing. He was tracking. He was tracking Alpha element. 3 of Alpha's operators had just come through the east gate and were moving across the open ground toward Pharaoh's position. RPG, she said. Northwest Courtyard. She heard Webb's breath catch. The RPG operator was still settling his position. He'd come out fast and was adjusting his stance, the backblast clearance behind him not quite right, a half-second of adjustment. And that half-second was the window, not a long window, not a comfortable window, but a window. She was already on him. The wind. 8 knots from the north, she'd already compensated for it. Range. The Northwest Courtyard from Whiskey was approximately 1,410 meters, which was longer than anything she'd shot tonight, which was longer than what she'd shown in the range demonstration, which was 2 meters past the distance Cross had been briefed on when he planned this operation. She didn't think about that. She exhaled. Held. The RPG operator raised the tube to his shoulder. She broke the trigger. The round traveled the 1,410 meters in just under 1.5 seconds. He dropped in the middle of the raising motion, the launcher falling from his grip and clattering against the courtyard stone. And the round that had been loaded into it did not fire because his finger was not on the trigger and his trigger hand was no longer functional. The 3 Alpha operators had heard the shot. They'd stopped moving, pressed to the ground in a trained response. She could see them through the scope, flat on the frozen earth, scanning. One of them had an IR laser on his rifle that was sweeping the courtyard. Webb keyed the radio. Alpha, all clear. RPG neutralized. Continue to package. A pause. Then a voice she recognized as Garrett's, Alpha's team lead. Who took that shot? Webb looked at her. She was already cycling the bolt, clearing the chamber, running a quick function check on the action. Her hands were doing what her hands always did after an engagement sequence, the automatic maintenance that kept the equipment ready regardless of what the nervous system was processing. Whiskey, Webb said into the radio. Another pause. Longer. Copy, Garrett said. Just that. But the register of the word was different from any word he'd put on the radio in the last 40 minutes. She laid the rifle back on the bipod and swept the compound one more time. Systematic. Slow. Every surface, every opening, every shadow. Nothing moved. The compound was not secure. She wouldn't call it secure until Alpha physically cleared every space, including whatever was under that tarp in the northwest corner. But the threat density had dropped to a level that the ground element could manage without her active engagement. Her radio clicked twice. Cross. She clicked once. Package, she said to Webb. He had his spotting scope on the depression. Alpha's got him. A pause. He's on his feet. He's walking with support. Another pause. Yeah. He's moving. She let out a breath. Not relief. She didn't do relief during an active mission, but there was a shift in her body. Some tension that had been structural rather than felt, the kind you don't notice until it begins to ease. And she let it ease. 4 rounds remaining. She kept the scope on the compound and waited for the ground element to clear the perimeter. Webb was watching the depression, watching Garrett's team move Faro toward the southern extraction route. And after a while he said quietly, not really to her, but in the direction of the night, "That RPG shot." She said nothing. "That was past the brief distance," he said. She tracked the northwest corner of the courtyard, the tarp, the open door. "I know." "By how much?" "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him adjust his position on the rock shelf. A small shift, the movement of a man who had been very still for a very long time and was allowing himself to be slightly less still. "Earlier," he said, "at the range, you said you stopped short because you wanted distance in reserve." "I did." "You knew this was going to happen." She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was that she hadn't known. She'd anticipated. There was a difference. Knowing was certainty. Anticipating was probability. You ran the variables, you assessed the compound structure, you looked at where the intelligence assessment might be conservative, and you made a judgment about what distance you might need and kept that distance unspent until you needed it. "I thought it was possible," she said. Webb sat with that for a moment. Below, the Alpha element had reached the southern approach with the package. She could see them moving. Slow, Faro between 2 operators, his gait uneven but continuous. They were heading toward the extraction vehicle, which had been staged 1,200 meters south of the compound at a widening in the track that could accommodate a turnaround. "Garrett's team is moving well," she said. "Yeah." Webb lowered his spotting scope for the first time in what felt like hours. He rolled his neck. She heard it crack twice, and then sat with his forearms on his knees, looking out at the compound below. 8 engagements, he said. She looked at him. 7. He shook his head. 8. The one in the scope that you held, the one you didn't take. She looked back at the compound. The retreating figure from earlier, the one who'd broken for the main structure when she'd taken the left target in the south courtyard. She'd let him run. Webb had noted it, hadn't questioned it at the time, but he'd been counting. He wasn't a threat after he broke, she said. I know. Webb set his spotting scope on the rock beside him. I'm just saying, 8 potential, and you made the right call on all 8. He paused. Including the one you didn't make. She had no response to that, not because she couldn't think of one, but because the response would have been something about how a miss was as costly as a poor shot, and how the threshold for engagement was not a moral calculation, but a tactical one, which was all true and also wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud in this moment. Her radio came alive. Cross's voice. Clear, unhurried, the voice of a man who had maintained his command register throughout an operation that had not gone according to plan and had been brought back to something like resolution by factors he was still processing. Whiskey, this is actual. Package is secure. Extraction is moving. Begin egress at your discretion. A pause. Outstanding work. She keyed once. Acknowledged. Webb started breaking down the spotting scope. She started breaking down the TAC 50. The careful, sequential disassembly that was the same process as the assembly, but in reverse, each component into its place in the Pelican case, nothing loose, nothing rattling, the same discipline on the way out as on the way in. The eastern tower below them was still dark. The figure she'd dropped there with the first shot of the night was still down. The compound itself had taken on the specific stillness that came after violence. Not peaceful, nothing like peaceful, but quieter than it had been. And in that quiet, there was the particular exhausted weight of a thing that had concluded. She closed the Pelican case, checked the latches, lifted it. Ready? Webb said. Ready, she said. They moved off the ridge into the dark, heading down the way they'd come, and behind them the compound sat cold and quiet under a sky that was just beginning, at its easternmost edge, to show the first pale argument of morning. The walk down took longer than the walk up, not because the terrain was harder going downhill. In some ways it was easier, gravity doing work that muscle had done on the ascent, but because the body after sustained high-alert operation doesn't transition cleanly into low-alert movement. It stays hot longer than it should. The hands stay slightly too ready. The eyes keep scanning for things that are no longer there to be scanned for. She noticed this in herself the way she always did. Not with frustration, just with the flat acknowledgement of a known process. The operational nervous system took time to downregulate. You couldn't rush it. You just moved and breathed and let the mountain do what the mountain did, which was demand enough physical attention that the other systems gradually found lower settings. Webb was quiet behind her. He'd been quiet since they left the ridge, which she read as his own version of the same process. He was a talker by nature. She'd figured that out in the first 30 minutes of working with him. And his silence now was not comfortable silence, but effortful silence. The silence of a man who had things to say and was holding them until the right moment. They were 40 minutes into the descent when his boots skidded on an ice sheet and he went down hard on his left knee. She heard it, the impact, the involuntary grunt, and stopped and turned. He was already getting up, one hand on the ground, pushing. His face in the green light of the nods had that particular compression of a man absorbing pain and not wanting to make it a thing. I'm good, he said, before she could ask. You went down on the kneecap. I know. I was there. He stood, tested the leg, put weight on it, and didn't put weight on it, and then put weight on it again. It's fine. It wasn't fine. She could see the slight hitch in his gait as they resumed movement, but it was functional, and functional was the relevant standard. She didn't press it. She adjusted her pace by about 10%, which she did without drawing attention to it, and they covered the remaining distance to the extraction point at that pace without incident. The FOB at 0630 was a different place than it had been at midnight. Not physically. The structures were the same, the layout was the same, the cold was the same cold. though the temperature had dropped another 6 degrees in the pre-dawn hours, and everything had the particular hard-frozen quality of a place where winter had stopped pretending to be temporary. What was different was the population of it, or rather the way the population moved. 12 hours ago, the FOB had been a forward operating base in a steady operational state, active but not activated, the specific low hum of a unit between missions. Now it was a FOB that had run a mission and brought everyone back, and the energy of that was different. Louder in some places, quieter in others. The extraction vehicles came through the main gate at 0623. She was in the second truck, in the rear-facing seat, the Pelican case on her lap because the case didn't leave her hands until she'd cleared and stowed the weapon personally, and that happened in the armory, not in a vehicle. The first truck carried Pharaoh. She'd seen him for the first time in person at the extraction point, not up close, from 30 meters, while Garrett's team transitioned him from foot movement to vehicle. He was thinner than the photograph, as she'd anticipated. His left ankle was wrapped, probably sprained from his drop off the compound wall. He had the specific expression of a man whose body was still running on emergency fuel and hadn't yet reached the point where the emergency was over enough to stop. She didn't go over to him. There was nothing she needed from him, and nothing she could tell him that he needed right now. The medical team would take him. Intelligence would need him eventually, but right now the only thing Elias Pharaoh needed was warmth and fluids, and the specific relief of being in a vehicle moving away from the place he'd been in. She could provide none of those things, and so she stayed in her truck. The debrief was scheduled for 900. She had 2 hours. She used one of them to sleep. Real sleep, not the performance of it. Though it took her 20 minutes to get there, her body still too activated, and woke up with the alarm feeling neither rested nor unrested, just present, which was sufficient. She cleaned up, ate something from the DFAC that she didn't taste enough to identify, and was at the debrief room 8 minutes early. Cross was already there. He was standing at the head of the table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, the kind of notes a man took when he was trying to organize something that didn't organize cleanly. He looked up when she came in. "Voss?" he said. "Sir?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude. That would come later, or not at all, depending on his disposition. Not the standard commander-to-operator regard. Something more considering than either of those. "How are you?" he said. It was a real question, not a formality. She could tell because he didn't move on immediately after asking it. "Functional," she said. He almost smiled, not quite. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which meant they were going to be in different registers for this conversation. Him managing, her being managed, and she was fine with that. She was used to it. The room filled over the next 7 minutes. Garrett came in with 2 of his team. Reed came in alone as usual and took a chair at the side rather than at the table. The position of a man who participated in debriefs but wasn't the primary audience for them. Webb came in last, moving with a visible limp he was doing his imperfect best to conceal. He sat across from her and gave her a look that communicated nothing specific and everything general about the last 8 hours. Kowalski was not in the debrief. She'd noticed his absence and hadn't asked about it. Cross started without preamble. 8 engagements from Whiskey, all confirmed, no misses, package extracted, minor injury, currently with medical. Ground element returned complete. He set his coffee down. That's the outcome. Now I need the sequence, and I need it precise. Because what I'm writing in the after action has to account for a mission that deviated from the planned timeline by approximately 6 minutes at the breach point and resolved with a threat neutralization at 1410 meters. He looked at her. Start from your position on the ridge. She walked through it. She didn't narrate. She reported, which was a different mode, stripped of interpretation and color, just the sequence of decisions and their outcomes. Webb filled in the spotter side observations where relevant. Garrett's team confirmed the ground side timeline. The debrief was professional, focused, and mostly undramatic, which was what a debrief was supposed to be. Mostly. She was midway through the account of the RPG engagement when Garrett stopped her. 1410, he said. Not a question. You said 1410 meters. Correct. Garrett looked at Cross. The briefed overwatch distance was 1400. 1407 from the whiskey position to the eastern tower, she said. 1410 to the northwest courtyard. That's where the RPG was. Garrett's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, not accusation, something that was trying to figure out what it was. You shot at a target 10 meters past the briefed capability. 10 meters past the demonstrated capability, she said, not the actual capability. Silence. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cross. Then he looked at Reed, which was where everyone in this room eventually looked when they wanted a reading on something they couldn't immediately calculate. Reed said nothing. He had his forearms on his knees and was looking at the table. You sandbagged the range demonstration, Garrett said. Back to her. I demonstrated what the mission required, she said. The mission required 1400. I showed 1400. You showed 1340, which qualified the shot. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He wasn't angry. She could read the difference between a man who was angry and a man who was recalibrating, and Garrett was recalibrating. So what's your actual ceiling? He said. She looked at him steadily. Mission dependent. Webb made a sound that wasn't a laugh and wasn't a cough. He covered it by looking at the ceiling. Cross let the moment sit for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be felt, not long enough to become something else. And then he moved on. The package identification. Walk me through that call. She walked him through it, the figure in the passage, the behavioral read, the decision to identify rather than engage. When she finished, Cross nodded. Intel had him in Building 3, he said. Your field assessment contradicted the intelligence product. My field assessment was based on direct observation, she said. I know. He wrote something on the legal pad. I'm not criticizing the call. I'm documenting it because the after-action needs to account for how the package was located. And the answer is that a whiskey operator identified him through direct scope observation and behavioral assessment, which means I need to describe the whiskey operator's capability in terms that support that conclusion. He stopped writing, looked at her. Which is where I have a problem, he said. She waited. My original personnel file on you, Cross said, lists your qualification as a sniper school graduate with 4 years of operational experience, current unit assignment redacted, purpose of augment assignment classified at TS. He set the pen down. That's a file that tells me you're qualified to support a long-range precision mission. It does not tell me... He paused. It does not tell me what the document in my safe tells me. The room was very quiet. Reed looked up from the table. I received a supplemental document, Tess, Cross said, at the same time as your personnel file. I should have read it immediately. I didn't because it was sealed and I was running a mission timeline. I read it after the range demonstration. He held her gaze. It describes a program that, officially, does not exist. It lists a unit designation that was formally dissolved 4 years ago, and it credits you with 26 confirmed precision engagements over a period of 6 years, in 6 different countries, under 4 different operational code names. He paused. All classified. None of them in any file I can access through standard channels. She said nothing. The document is authenticated, Cross said. I've seen enough of these to know when one is real. This one is real. He picked up the pen again, then set it back down, the gesture of a man who is buying himself a half second. What I don't understand is why a person with that record was sent to this FOB as an unclassified augment with a personnel file that told me nothing. The room stayed quiet. Garrett was looking at his hands. Webb was looking at her. She thought about how to answer. Not what to answer. She knew what she could and couldn't say, and the boundary there was clear. But how to answer in a way that was honest within the boundary. The program was dissolved because visibility became a problem, she said. When the unit officially stopped existing, the personnel with that unit's records had 2 options: re-enter the conventional system with a sanitized file, or leave. I re-entered. A pause. The sanitized file is the file you received. And the supplemental document? I didn't send that. I know you didn't. I'm asking if you knew it existed. She met his eyes. I knew something like it existed. I didn't know it would arrive here. Cross held her gaze for a long moment. She didn't look away and didn't add anything. Who sent it? He said. I don't know, she said, which was mostly true. She had a theory, and the theory had a name attached to it, but a theory wasn't knowledge, and she wasn't going to offer a name she couldn't verify. Reed spoke. First time since the debrief started. His voice was quiet, unhurried. The voice of a man who had been listening to everything and had been waiting for the right place to put words in. "Does it matter?" he said. Cross looked at him. "Operationally," Reed said, "right now at 0900 on the day after a successful extraction with 0 friendly casualties and the package in medical, does it matter who sent the document?" A pause. "It matters for the after action," Cross said. "Then write that the whiskey operator performed in excess of the briefed parameters and exceeded mission requirements," Reed said. "And write that the personnel file provided at assignment did not accurately represent the operator's capability, which is a personnel system failure and not an operational one." He looked at Mara. "And if you want to know more about the file and where it came from, that's a conversation for a different room and a different clearance level." Cross looked at Reed, then at her, then at the legal pad. "Fine," he said, not happily, but not resistant either. The voice of a man accepting a practical reality even while remaining uncomfortable with it. He picked up the pen. "Let's finish the sequence." They finished the sequence. The debrief broke at 10:40. People moved toward the door in ones and twos, the post-debrief dispersal that happened in every room after every mission, the transition back to individual tracks. Reed stopped beside her before she reached the door. "You knew about the document," he said, quietly, not accusing, stating. "I thought something might come," she said, same volume. "From who?" She looked at him. He looked back. His face was doing the thing it did when he was running a calculation. The specific stillness of a man who already had several variables and was deciding how many more he wanted. "You were in the program," he said. Not a question. She said nothing. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he'd arrived at independently. "The unit designation in the document. It's a designation I've seen before. Once. 3 years ago. In a targeting package that came through my team for a mission in a place I can't name." He paused. "The precision fire support on that mission was attributed to a source we were told was a supporting ISR asset." He looked at her. "It wasn't an ISR asset, was it?" She looked at the door. "You don't have to confirm it," Reed said. "I'm not asking you to." He shifted his weight. "I'm telling you that I know what that program was. And I know what it cost the people in it. And I think you got handed a file that was designed to make sure no one at this FOB would know what they were getting until you proved it yourself." She turned back to him. "Why would someone do that?" she said. "Because people with your record and your file get reassigned to quiet billets where they don't make anyone uncomfortable," Reed said. "Or they get retired out, or they get handed augment assignments with sanitized files and sent to rooms full of people who'll spend the first 12 hours making sure you know you don't belong." He held her gaze. Someone wanted to make sure that didn't happen this time. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a generator cycled up, and the lights in the corridor through the open door brightened slightly. "It wasn't comfortable," she said. "No," Reed said. "I don't think it was designed to be comfortable. I think it was designed to be necessary." He paused. "You needed them to see you prove it, not be told." She thought about Kowalski pulling the file out of her hands, the room erupting, Webb's bark of disbelief, all of it. "I could have done without Kowalski," she said. Reed almost smiled. It was a different almost smile than Cross's. Where Cross's was controlled, Reed's was rueful. "Yeah," he said, "Kowalski's a lot." He moved toward the door, stopped once, hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, "the RPG shot, 1410. He shook his head slightly. "I've been doing this work for 16 years. I've worked with some of the best precision shooters in the U.S. inventory." He looked back at her. "That shot, in those conditions, at that range, on a partially obscured target with a 4-round conservation constraint," he stopped. "I don't have a category for that." He left. She stood in the empty debrief room for a moment, then she picked up her bag and walked out. Kowalski found her at 1200. She was in the equipment bay, field stripping the TAC-50 for a full cleaning. The post-mission maintenance that she did herself rather than handing to the armorer, partly because she was particular about it, and partly because the process of cleaning a weapon was one of the few things that required enough focused attention to quiet the part of her brain that ran operational replays for hours after a mission concluded. She heard him come in, heard him stop. She kept working. The bolt assembly came apart in her hands with the smooth efficiency of something done 10,000 times. The parts laid out on the cleaning mat in the specific order she'd established years ago. He stood there for almost 30 seconds before he said anything. The RPG. She picked up a cleaning rod. Garrett's team, Kowalski said. They were walking right into it. He had the tube up. He stopped. If you'd been 10 seconds slower on that read. I wasn't 10 seconds slower, she said. No, he said. You weren't. He was quiet again. She worked the rod through the barrel. I pulled your file in front of 30 people, he said, and called you a tourist. I heard. I'm aware that you heard. He stopped again. She could hear the particular quality of his silence, the compressed sound of a man working up to something that didn't come naturally. I'm saying I was wrong. She set the cleaning rod down, looked at him. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not folded, the deliberate posture of a man who had decided not to use his body as a shield in this conversation. His face was doing something that cost him. I know you were wrong, she said. He held her gaze. Is that it? What else do you want? He shook his head. I don't want anything. I wanted to say it. He looked at the parts on the cleaning mat. 8 confirmed from that ridge in those conditions, and the one you didn't take. He said that last part the way Webb had said it, with a specific quality that meant he'd heard it from someone, probably Webb, and it had landed on him the right way. That's not a tourist. No, she said. It's not. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and couldn't locate what it was. Then he turned toward the door. Kowalski, she said. He stopped. The guy on the east wall. The retreating figure. The one she'd let run. You asked why I didn't take the shot. He turned back slowly. She hadn't offered this during the debrief. No, I didn't. You were thinking it. Everyone was thinking it. She picked up the cleaning rod again. He was 32 years old. He dropped his weapon when the breach happened. He ran because he was terrified, not because he had a plan. She ran the rod through the barrel. That's not a threat. That's a man who was in the wrong place because someone told him to be there. She looked up. There are enough names on the other side of the ledger. I don't add to it without cause. Kowalski stood very still. How could you know he was 32? He said. I couldn't, she said. But he moved like 32, could have been 28, could have been 35. She set the rod down. Still not a threat. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he walked out without saying anything, which was the right thing to do, and she knew it was the right thing, because she would have done the same. Webb came at 1400 when she was reassembling the rifle. He dropped into a chair across the cleaning mat without asking if she minded. His knee had been wrapped. She could see the bulk of it under his pants leg, and he sat with it extended at an angle that suggested it was bothering him more than he was admitting. Medical said I should stay off it for 2 days, he said. You should stay off it for 2 days. I told them I'd stay off it for 4 hours. She picked up the bolt assembly. That's not the same thing. No, but it's the thing I'm going to do. He watched her work. Cross is writing the after action. Reed told him to document the mission outcome without getting into the record specifics, which Cross is doing under protest. There's apparently a notation that additional personnel documentation is pending, which is military paperwork language for, we know there's more here and we're not allowed to ask about it. He paused. Garrett asked me what I knew about you. She looked up. What did you tell him? I told him what I know. He held her gaze, which is that you can shoot, you make good calls under pressure, and your personnel file is a fiction. A beat. I didn't tell him about the document. Cross hasn't shared it beyond Reed. She went back to the rifle. Is there more? Webb said. More than what's in the document. She considered how to answer that. Probably, she said. There always is. He was quiet for a moment. The program Reed mentioned, the dissolved unit. She said nothing. I'm not read in, he said. I know I'm not read in. I'm not asking to be. He shifted in the chair, and she saw the effort it cost him to find a position that didn't aggravate the knee. I'm asking because he stopped, started again. I've been in for 10 years. I've seen guys get recognized for things they deserved recognition for, and I've seen guys get buried in files that didn't reflect what they actually did. And usually the reason for the burial is some combination of politics and classification, and he spread his hands. You've been doing precision work for 6 years with 26 confirmed, and the only person who knows your name is whoever sanitized your file. She seated the bolt. That was the arrangement, she said. Was it an arrangement you chose? She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated. More complicated than a debrief room answer. More personal than she usually went in these conversations. But Webb had been on that ridge with her, and that created a different kind of access than most people got. At first, she said, the invisibility was useful. It meant no one was tracking you, no one was building a case against you, no one in a competing program was trying to absorb your budget. She picked up the barrel. And then the program ended and the invisibility just continued. But without the program, it didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like the system had forgotten it had made one. Webb looked at her for a long time. And now Cross has a document that starts the conversation about unforgetting. Maybe, she said, or it gets reclassified and refiled and the system goes back to doing what it was doing. Cross won't let it get refiled. She looked at him. I've worked under 3 different LTCs, Webb said. Cross is the kind who writes the actual truth in the after action, even when the truth is inconvenient. He's gotten crossways with G3 twice in the last year because of it. He paused. He's going to write what happened on that ridge. All of it. With your name on it. She held the barrel in her hands and looked at it. The metal was clean, newly oiled, every surface correctly maintained. She'd put 8 rounds through it in the last 8 hours, at ranges between 1,190 and 1,410 meters. In mountain conditions, in darkness, and it had functioned without a single malfunction. She'd maintained it correctly, and it had done what it was designed to do. She thought about what Reed had said, about the document and why someone might have sent it, about being necessary rather than comfortable. She thought about 26 operations in 6 years, in 6 countries, none of them in any file she could point someone to. She thought about the specific weight of that, not regret exactly, but the weight of work done correctly and unacknowledged, the way a correctly maintained rifle that never malfunctions is never thanked for not malfunctioning. She assembled the last component, ran the function check, set the rifle down. If Cross writes it accurately, she said, the people who sanitized the file in the first place are going to have opinions about that. Probably, Webb said. That creates problems. Probably, he said again. She looked at the assembled rifle, looked at him. Then we'll deal with them, she said. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't resolution. It was just the practical acknowledgement of the next thing in a sequence. The same quality of attention she gave the next target in a sequence, neither anticipated with dread nor awaited with eagerness. Just the next thing. Webb nodded. He got up, put weight on the bad knee, and took the first step toward the door with the gait of a man who had told medical 4 hours and was going to hold to it regardless of what his knee thought about the arrangement. At the door he stopped and turned back. Voss. She looked up. On the ridge, he said. When you called that RPG, the way you said it, just flat, no noise in your voice. He looked at her. I was running cold. My hands were doing the thing where they don't want to be still. He said this without apparent embarrassment, the admission of a man who had decided honesty was more useful than pride. You never changed register, not once. She looked at him. You get scared? He said. She thought about it, about what fear actually felt like in that situation. Not the cinematic version, the movie Fear, but the real thing, the specific biological signal that something with teeth was nearby. Yeah, she said, but later. He considered that. Then he nodded once, a nod that carried more weight than most nods, and walked out into the FOB afternoon. She sat alone in the equipment bay with the clean rifle on the mat in front of her and the afternoon light coming through the single high window at an angle that made the dust in the air visible, each particle moving in its slow, suspended drift. Somewhere in the medical facility 40 meters away, Elias Farrow was either sleeping or staring at a ceiling and trying to understand that he was still alive. Cross was in his office writing an after-action report that was going to make someone, somewhere, very uncomfortable. Reed was probably already planning the next thing. Reed was always already planning the next thing. And in a file somewhere, in a system she'd re-entered with a name that was her name and a record that wasn't, something had started moving. She didn't know where it would go. She didn't know what it would cost. She picked up the rifle, stood, carried it toward the armory. The cost was a problem for later. Right now she needed to put the weapon back correctly so it was ready for whoever needed it next. That was enough. That had always been enough. The armory specialist was the same kid from the night before. He looked up when she came through the door with the TAC 50 case, and something in his face shifted. Not the cautious blankness he'd given her when she'd asked for the torque wrench, but something more open than that. The expression of someone who had learned something since the last time he'd seen you and hadn't yet figured out how to carry it. She set the case on the counter, opened it, laid the rifle out for his inspection. He went through the standard receipt process, serial number check, condition assessment, ammunition accounting. She'd returned 10 rounds of the 14 she'd signed out. He counted them twice, which was protocol, and then he looked at the number in the ledger and looked at the rounds on the counter and looked at her. 4 expended, he said. She said nothing. 8 engagements, 4 rounds. The math didn't match, and he was doing what any competent armorer did, which was notice the math. The case log will show 8 rounds fired, she said. The discrepancy is because I loaded selectively. 2 rounds were returned to inventory before infill. She pulled the 2 rounds she'd pulled during her pre-mission inspection from her jacket pocket and set them on the counter beside the others. Case neck inconsistency. I didn't want them in the rotation. He looked at the 2 rounds, picked one up, turned it slowly, held it to the light. The inconsistency was small. She'd spent 45 seconds identifying it during the inspection, and she doubted most armorers would catch it in a standard check. He caught it. Yeah, he said quietly, setting it back down. Yeah, I see it. He made the notation in the ledger. Then he looked up. You were out there all night. That's where the mission was. I know, He stopped, looked at the rifle. I heard some of what came back. The debrief room's not as private as people think. She closed the empty Pelican case and locked the latches. What did you hear? Enough, he said. He slid the ledger across for her signature. 1410 meters. That's what I heard. She signed, slid it back. He held her gaze for a moment. He was 22, maybe 23, with the look of a kid who had joined the army to be near operational units because he hadn't been selected for one himself, which was a harder thing to carry than most people understood. Is that true? He said. 1410? The case and the ledger are accurate, she said. That's what matters. She picked up the empty case and walked out. Behind her, she heard him pick up the 2 imperfect rounds and set them in the discard bin, and she heard the specific sound of him handling the TAC 50 with a different quality of care than he'd used when he'd handed it to her 20-some hours ago. The next 3 days at FOB Rhino had the texture of aftermath. Aftermath was its own operational condition. She'd learned that years ago. People thought it was a return to normal, and in some ways it was. The rhythms of the FOB reasserting themselves, meals and briefings and maintenance cycles. But underneath the reassertion was something that didn't normalize quickly, the specific altered quality of a space where something significant had happened and people were still deciding what to do with it. She noticed it in the way people moved around her. Not dramatically. Nobody saluted her in the chow line or stopped conversations when she walked into a room. It was subtler. The eye contact that lasted a half-second longer than it had, the quality of silence that preceded it. Men who had laughed in the briefing room 3 days ago now found reasons to not quite meet her eyes when they passed her in the corridor, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Garrett's team was the exception. They'd been downrange with her, which created a different relationship than the FOB observers. Garrett himself stopped by the transient quarters on the second day with 2 of his guys, and the conversation they had was short and factual. He wanted to walk through the package identification call one more time, he said, for his own understanding. She walked him through it. He asked 2 smart questions. His guys listened without speaking. When Garrett left, he paused in the doorway. I was one of the 3 on the ground when you called the RPG, he said. So, he looked like he had more to say, and had decided the word "so" covered it. She nodded. He left. The second exception was Pharaoh. Voss. He found her on the second morning outside the medical facility, where she'd gone to ask the flight surgeon about a minor issue with her right shoulder, a pull she'd developed on the descent from whiskey, probably from carrying the Pelican case wrong through one of the technical sections. The flight surgeon had given her a look that suggested she'd waited too long to have it checked and recommended 2 days of restricted upper body activity, which she noted and planned to handle in the way she handled most medical recommendations that conflicted with mission readiness, which was to use her own judgment. She was outside in the sharp cold of the FOB morning, doing a slow rotation of the shoulder to test the surgeon's assessment, when a man appeared at the medical facility door and stood in the frame. He was thinner than the photograph. The ankle had a visible compression wrap above his boot. He had the pallid, stripped-down look of someone who had been through something and hadn't yet had time to reassemble the exterior. His beard was long, his eyes were clear, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. She stopped the shoulder rotation. He came down the 2 steps from the door and crossed the distance between them, and she could see the ankle giving him trouble, not debilitating, but present. And he moved with the careful patience of a man who had decided to stop pretending he wasn't injured. Voss, he said. He'd clearly gotten the name from somewhere. Dr. Pharaoh, she said. He stopped a few feet from her. In the daylight, he looked older than the photograph. Not in a bad way, just with the specific added gravity of someone who had experienced something that years alone don't account for. He looked at her the way people looked at you when they were trying to make an impression of you that would hold, trying to see the whole of a person, not just the surface. I was told... He stopped. Started again. The medical team told me the mission had a precision overwatch element, that there was someone on the ridge. He paused. I saw you outside. I asked the nurse which one. She waited. In the passage, he said, between Building 3 and the wall. There was a guard in the south doorway of Building 2. I saw him turn. I thought... He stopped again. The memory was close to the surface, and he was managing it in real time, the slight, careful quality of a man who had not yet had enough distance from something to handle it without effort. I thought he'd seen me. He had, she said, or he was about to. Pharaoh looked at her. I heard a shot. He was gone. She said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I've been trying to figure out what to say to whoever. He spread his hands, a gesture that was more expressive than any specific word he could have chosen. I've been told there's not a lot I'm allowed to know about how this worked. Classification. I understand. I worked in conflict zones for 6 years. I know how this goes. He paused. But I needed to find the person and, at minimum, stand in front of them. You found me, she said. Yeah. He looked at the ground for a second, then back at her. Thank you seems... He shook his head. Thank you is what you say when someone holds a door. I don't have the right word for this. You don't need one, she said. He looked at her for another moment. There was something working in his face, not sentiment exactly, more like the specific weight of a man who had been a professional his whole life, had moved through dangerous places with the competence of experience, had been taken by people who were not careful with the lives they held, and was standing here on a frozen FOB having a conversation that shouldn't have been possible. I heard you'd been on the ridge all night, he said. The mission required it. Yes. He seemed to turn that over. I know what it required. I've been debriefed on enough of these to understand the sequence. He looked at the ridgeline beyond the FOB perimeter, the dark jagged line that separated the sky from the terrain. That's a long night, in those conditions. It's a longer night in a compound, she said. He held her gaze, and then he did something she didn't expect. He nodded, once, with a gravity that carried everything the right word would have carried if he'd had it, and turned and walked carefully back toward the medical facility door. She watched him go. Then she went back to the shoulder rotation. On. The orders came on the 3rd day. Not quietly. Nothing that involved Cross and the documentation he'd been building came quietly. She was in the transient quarters at 1600 when Cross's runner appeared at her door and told her the LTC wanted her in his office. Cross's office was small, deliberately. He'd positioned his desk against the far wall so visitors had to cross the full width of the room to reach the chair opposite him, which was a classic piece of small space authority management that she'd seen in better and worse versions over the years. He didn't do it to intimidate. Cross wasn't built for intimidation games. He did it because he was a man who thought about spatial relationships and had arranged the ones he could control into the configuration that worked best for the kind of conversation he tended to need to have. He was standing when she came in, which modified the dynamic. There was a second person in the room. She recognized him before she had a name for the recognition, a colonel, based on insignia, with the bearing of someone who operated above the level of this FOB and had come here specifically, which meant he'd come from somewhere that required travel, which meant this wasn't incidental. She looked at Cross. Voss, Cross said. Colonel Hastings, J2, SOCOM. SOCOM. J2 was the Intelligence Directorate for Special Operations Command. Colonels from J2 did not typically appear at forward operating bases to meet augment personnel. She filed the anomaly and waited. Staff Sergeant, Hastings said. His voice was even, measured, the voice of a man who had learned to communicate without giving information he hadn't decided to give. Sit down. She sat. Cross remained standing, which she noted. He wasn't sitting behind his desk for this conversation. He was standing slightly to the side of it, which put him in a neutral position relative to both her and Hastings. Neither presiding nor subordinated. Hastings had a folder. He set it on the desk without opening it. I'll be direct, he said. The after-action report Colonel Cross filed this morning reached my desk at 1100. I was on a flight by 1300. He let that sit for a moment. The precision engagement sequence you executed on Operation Heron is not consistent with the capabilities documented in your personnel file. I'm aware, she said. Cross's report references a supplemental document which I'm told you're aware exists. I know a document was sent, she said. I don't know by whom. Hastings looked at her steadily. I do, he said. She waited. The document originated from a retired warrant officer named Price, formerly attached to the program your unit operated under, Hastings said. Price has been sending variants of this document to command-level officers for approximately 14 months, trying to have your record and the records of 2 other personnel from the program formally re-entered into the accessible system. He paused. This is the first time one of those documents reached a command element during an active operation, which is the first time it produced a result that J2 couldn't quietly redirect. Price. She knew the name. Price had been the unit's warrant officer for 4 years, the administrative backbone of a program that had no administrative visibility, the man who had kept records that officially didn't exist because he'd believed, apparently more than anyone had told him to believe, that they should. She hadn't spoken to Price in 2 years. Is Price in trouble? She said. Hastings looked at her for a moment. Not for me, he said. He's retired. His options were limited. A pause. He made a judgment call about what the right move was. Given what Cross's report documents, I'm not in a position to argue the outcome. She held his gaze. Then what happens now? Hastings opened the folder, turned it to face her. She looked at the document inside. It was not a short document. She read the first section, the organizational header, the subject line, the authorization block, and understood immediately what she was looking at. A formal record reconstruction request, her name, her service number, a program designation that hadn't appeared in any accessible file for 4 years, and a list of operational attachments that constituted the actual shape of her service record rather than the sanitized version. This is a preliminary document, Hastings said. It initiates a review process. It's not an immediate correction. The classification levels involved mean the review will take months, possibly longer. Some of the operational details will remain compartmented regardless of outcome. He paused. But the process, once initiated, creates a formal record that you submitted to a review. That record is itself accessible at the appropriate clearance level. She looked at the document, at her name on it, at the list of operational attachments that represented 6 years of work that had existed, functionally, in the space between what was documented and what was real. If I sign this, she said, What changes immediately? Your personnel file gets a notation that additional documentation is pending review, Hastings said. You stay in your current billet until the review completes or until an assignment emerges that's consistent with your actual capability profile. He paused. Which is the second thing I'm here to discuss. She looked up from the document. Cross spoke for the first time since the introduction. There's a position, he said. SOCOM Precision Fires Training Cadre, Fort Bragg. They're standing up a new long-range qualification program for special operations units. Not just sniper certification, a full precision effects integration course. They need instructors with operational experience at ranges and in conditions that exceed the standard qualification parameters. He looked at her steadily. Reed recommended you this morning. I co-signed it. She sat with that. The training cadre. An instructor position. She thought about what that meant. Not the rank implications or the assignment benefits, but the actual daily substance of it. Operators coming through a qualification course. Teaching the things she knew how to do in the context she knew how to do it. Making the knowledge transferable rather than solitary. 26 confirmed engagements, 6 years, 6 countries. A record that had existed in the hands of a retired warrant officer and a sealed envelope. I'd be identified, she said. Not resistance, just accounting for the variable. Within the classification tier of the program, Hastings said. Not publicly, but within the community, yes. People who come through the course will know who's running it. She thought about the armory specialist and his question, about Garrett's so in the doorway, about Reed saying I don't have a category for that. She thought about what it had felt like to walk into that briefing room with a canvas bag and a sanitized file and 30 operators who had decided in the first 3 seconds what she was. There's a condition, Hastings said. She looked at him. The condition is yours, Hussein, he said. If you sign the preliminary document and accept the assignment, you have the right to attach a statement of record, a formal account of the program's operational history from a participant's perspective. It goes into the review file. It doesn't become publicly accessible, but it becomes part of the official review record. He paused. Price has already submitted one. 2 of the other personnel have submitted ones. He held her gaze and, there's a space for yours. She looked at the document again, at the space at the bottom where a signature would go. She thought about 6 years of correct work, correctly done, that had existed in the gap between what the system recorded and what actually happened. She thought about Price, spending 14 months sending documents to command-level officers in various installations because he decided the gap was wrong, and he was going to close it however he could from retirement. She thought about a shot at 1,410 meters in the dark, into a courtyard, through a wind that had been cycling on a 48-second pattern, at a man with an RPG tube who had 3 operators in his sightline. And she thought about the fact that the only reason she could make that shot was because she'd been making shots like it, progressively longer and harder, for 6 years in places that didn't officially exist. You couldn't take that away. It had already happened. The record not reflecting it didn't change what it was, but the record not reflecting it meant the next person who came through a door with a canvas bag and a sanitized file and a capability that the room wasn't ready for would face the same 30 operators, the same laughter, the same pulled file. She picked up the pen. Signed. Bam. She didn't leave immediately. The orders gave her 72 hours to prepare for departure, and she used most of that time the way she always used transition time, working through the practical requirements of movement, packing, clearing her billet, the administrative tail end of an assignment that had lasted 4 days and felt longer. On the last evening, Reed found her at the firing range. She wasn't shooting. She was sitting at the bench at the end of the range with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking downrange at the 1,200-meter target frame in the last light. She'd come out here without a clear purpose and had found herself sitting, which was not something she did often enough to have a comfortable relationship with. Reed sat beside her on the bench. He didn't ask why she was there. He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. Hastings brief you? She said. Cross did, Reed said. Training cadre. Bragg. Yeah. Good assignment. Maybe, she said. He looked at her sideways. You're not sure. I've been alone with the work for a long time, she said. Teaching it is different. It's the same work, Reed said. You're just pointing it at people instead of targets. She looked at him. That's either reassuring or alarming. Take it however it lands, he said. He looked downrange. The 1,200-meter target was barely visible in the failing light, just a pale rectangle against the dark terrain. The guys who came through the range demonstration. Webb, Kowalski. My people. He paused. They've been doing this work for years. Most of them are good. Some of them are very good. He paused again. None of them can do what you did on that ridge, and they know it now, and knowing it is going to make them better. He looked at her. That's already teaching. You did it without trying. Mom should saint. She thought about that. Read, she said. Yeah. The program. When it was running. She looked at the cold coffee. Did you know about it? Before the document. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something. I suspected, he said. There were missions over the years where the precision support didn't fit the assets that were documented on the operation. Too accurate. Too far. Wrong atmospheric conditions for the ranges the documented assets could achieve. He turned the coffee cup in a slow half rotation. I ran the math once, on a mission in 2021. The shot that was credited to an ISR-coordinated air asset would have required a precision engagement from approximately 1,650 meters, in a valley with the kind of thermal gradient that makes air-delivered munitions drift in ways that don't look like they drifted. He looked at her. I wrote it up, and the write-up got redirected, and I was told the air asset explanation was correct. And you dropped it, she said. I dropped it, he said. Not because I believed it, because I understood that some things operate in the gap between what's documented and what happened, and trying to close that gap sometimes closes the program that created it. He paused. I was wrong about that. Price was right. She looked at him. Price believed the gap was wrong from the beginning, Reed said. He spent 4 years in the program keeping records nobody asked him to keep because he thought someday somebody would need them. He shook his head. He's 71 years old and retired, and he's been spending his own money sending documents to command-level officers because he thinks the people who did that work deserve to have their names on it. She didn't have a response to that. She felt something, not sentiment exactly, but the specific weight of having been held in someone else's accounting for years without knowing it. Price keeping records. Price sending documents. Price flying the gap between what was real and what was documented on his own time, as at his own cost because he decided the cost of not flying it was higher. She would write the statement of record tonight. She hadn't been sure before. She was sure now. The morning she left, the temperature had dropped enough that the FOB had the specific crystalline quality of a place where the cold had become absolute rather than gradual. Ice on every surface that held water, the sky pale and cloudless. Her breath visible as she walked across the compound toward the flight line with the canvas bag on her shoulder and the Pelican case in her hand. Empty now, the TAC-50 back in armory inventory, signed out to no one. She heard boots behind her, more than one set. She turned. Kowalski was there. Behind him, Webb, limping less than the day before but still limping. Garrett. 2 of Garrett's team. The armory specialist out of what must have been his scheduled shift, in his cold weather gear with his hands in his pockets. 3 operators she recognized from the range demonstration but hadn't spoken to since. She stopped, looked at them. Kowalski's face was doing something that didn't belong in the vocabulary of a man who made his living being hard to read. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked at it, then at her, and then he did something she genuinely hadn't expected from him. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten, which was already unusual. She read the first paragraph and understood immediately what she was holding, a formal statement in Kowalski's handwriting, attesting to what he had witnessed at FOB Rhino over the last 4 days. Not a debrief document, not an operational record, a personal statement, the kind of document that existed in the review file that Hastings had described, where participants could submit accounts from their own perspective. He'd written it in the night. She could tell from the handwriting, slightly uneven in the early sections, more settled toward the end, the way handwriting goes when a person starts uncertain and finds their footing. "It's for the review file," Kowalski said. "If Cross can route it there." She looked at him. "I pulled your file in front of 30 people," he said. "I want something in the record that says I saw what I saw and I'm saying it with my name on it." He paused. "That's all." She folded the letter, put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Not the easy nod of a man who'd completed a transaction, the effortful nod of a man who had done something that cost him and had decided the cost was worth it. Webb stepped forward. He had a small notebook, the kind with the dark green cover, tactical pocket notebook, standard issue. He held it out. She looked at it. "Spotting data," he said. "From the ridge. I wrote up my side of the call sequence while it was fresh." He paused. "Reed said it might be useful for the course curriculum. Instructor perspective on a real wind call sequence, documented by the spotter." He looked slightly embarrassed about the gesture, which made it more genuine rather than less. "Or don't use it. I don't care. I wrote it up." She took the notebook. The armory specialist, she still didn't know his name, she realized, and she regretted that, raised his hand in a small, slightly awkward wave from the back of the group. She returned it. She looked at all of them. The men who had laughed 3 days ago and the men who hadn't. The men who'd been on the ridge and the men who'd been on the ground, and the man who'd issued her ammunition at midnight and counted her rounds at the other end. "I need to make the flight," she said. "We know," Garrett said. She turned and walked toward the flight line. She heard it before she'd gone 15 meters. The sound of boots on frozen ground, not following, but stopping, and then the specific silence of a group of people doing the same thing simultaneously. She turned around. 31 people were standing at attention, not parade ground attention, the informal version, the one that didn't require command, the one that happened when people decided it for themselves. Kowalski, Webb, Garrett, and his team. The armory specialist with his hand at his brow. Reed, who had appeared at the back without her noticing, standing very straight with an expression that carried everything he hadn't said and wasn't going to say. She held it for a moment. Then she came to attention herself, facing them, and rendered the salute, held it, released it. Then she turned, picked up the Pelican case, and walked to the aircraft without looking back. Not because she didn't want to look back, because she'd learned a long time ago that the work wasn't in the looking back. The work was in the next thing. It had always been the next thing. The ramp came down, cold air rushed up to meet her, and she walked into it. 6 weeks later, a package arrived at Fort Bragg addressed to Staff Sergeant Mara Voss, Personnel Affairs, SOCOM Training Cadre. Inside was a single photograph. No note, no return address. The photograph was of a ridge at dawn, taken from somewhere above it, at an angle that showed the shelf of rock and the depression in the stone where a bipod would seat naturally, and the small pile of stones at the left edge that could have been accidental. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it on his wall above her desk, where she would see it every morning when she came in to teach the next group of operators how to read wind. They couldn't feel at distances they hadn't tried yet, in conditions they hadn't imagined, on missions that would ask them for more than they thought they had. She would teach them what she knew. Not all of it. No one could teach all of it, the part above the math that lived in the body and the eye and the accumulated weight of years. But enough. Enough to give the next person standing on a frozen ridge in the dark a few more seconds and a few better tools and a slightly smaller gap between what was possible and what they believed. That was the job now. It was, she found, a job she was ready for. Some people spend years doing the most important work of their lives in rooms that don't know their name. That doesn't make the work less real. It makes the record more necessary. And the people who keep it, against every convenience that says not to, more essential than they'll ever be told.